The Cure's fourth album, Pornography, came out in 1982. It really continues in the gothic rock style that 17 Seconds initiated, which Faith then continued, and Pornography is kind of the natural conclusion to it in a lot of ways. If I had to choose one word to define the Pornography album, I would choose madness. While 17 Seconds, Faith, and even Three Imaginary Boys were very much characterized by their restraint, Pornography, I think, is characterized by a lack of restraint. This is an album where it feels like you're just going insane listening to it, and it feels like the band certainly went insane as they made it. I think far and away this is The Cure's darkest record, and I think it's their most disorienting record for sure. And I've seen online where people have challenged that idea, where people have said, oh, Pornography isn't that dark of a record. But really, I think it is. This is a record that was made by a band that was at their wit's end. And if you look at Three Imaginary Boys, that's a very bouncy album, and dare I say, a pretty happy album, all things considered. I think it's a pretty massive jump to go from the band that The Cure were in 1979 when they released Three Imaginary Boys to 1982 when they released Pornography. Three Imaginary Boys and Pornography are albums that sound like they were made by completely different bands. And of course, everyone in the band was really young when they made these records. When they made Pornography, they would have been like 22, 23. And so the story goes that the band made Faith, right? Which in itself was a very dark record because it was characterized by the loss that the band experienced outside of making records. Before they made Faith, people around the band died, and it affected them, and it very much affected the record that Faith became. So the band made this record, they made Faith, and then they had to go and tour it. And at this time, the band was playing like 100+ shows a year. So they were constantly going up on stage every single night and singing songs about loss and death, and then they would get off stage and then they would drink and they would do drugs and they would fight each other. So this was a band who had lost their faith, and they had lost their friends and family, they had lost people around them, and they were touring relentlessly. And as mentioned before, they turned to drugs and alcohol to try to cope with these problems, but as drugs and alcohol often do, they only exacerbated these problems. 17 Seconds is a pretty dark record, Faith is a much darker record, and then Pornography, I think, is perhaps the darkest record of them all. It just sounds so utterly hopeless, and it sounds like the band is completely despairing at this point in their career. And in fact, by the end of this tour, the band broke up, and there was no longer a Cure. On the final date of the Pornography tour / show, they played a song called The Cure is Dead, because for all intents and purposes, The Cure were officially dead. So this is a record that I think is very abrasive, it's very challenging, it's not something with any pop hits on it. There are people out there who believe that this is the #1 Cure record, and honestly, I get it. Like 100% I get it. This is a record that feels like a hallucination or a nightmare or a fever dream. It just feels like everything bad all cobbled together at once.